Thanks for joining our next session. And we're going to be talking all about collaboration and the importance of having allies across procure to pay. I've got a couple of great people joining me in the conversation today, and that's P2P subject matter expert Stephen King and top voice in procurement Dave Jones, who is also head of IT procurement at Virgin Media O2. Thanks, guys, for joining us today and sharing all of your insights with our community. I think perhaps maybe, Stephen, let's start the conversation with you, because I'm quite often at PPN talking about collaboration across finance and procurement. But how important do you think that is to P2P success?
I think for P2P it's very important because if you're an accounts payable team, you really want to understand the upstream and downstream effects of what you're really doing. And if you're in likes of procurement or finance teams impacted by the accounts payable side, it's really important to have that conversation and that communication between the teams just to understand the whole end-to-end process for your own perspective. But if there's any particular issues you're trying to resolve, it's good to have that collaboration and some allies in the other team who understand their own processes and understand how it will impact AP and just generally help the process going forward and make sure the process is that little bit better.
Yeah, and ultimately that's what we're trying to achieve, isn't it?
Yeah.
By anything that we do, we talk about transformation programs, trying to make it that little bit better, as you say. Dave, I mean, would you agree with that? How important do you think this kind of collaboration piece is? How important is it to the success of procure to pay?
Yeah, it's hugely important to think about the end-to-end process. I think sometimes people think in their individual silos within the procure to pay kind of life cycle, if you like. Thinking end-to-end, right from the supplier onboarding, how do you get them onboarded, potentially putting catalogues in place with the P2P team, ensuring suppliers that are being onboarded can support whatever the invoice scanning kind of solution is. Very occasionally, because most of the time people work very well together, but occasionally people miss that. And then the supplier that's onboarded just can't support whatever the P2P system is. So it's really thinking about it end to end.
Yeah, and I suppose those touch points in between.
Yeah.
What do you think it is? Because I was saying to Stephen just now, we talk about that collaboration piece quite a bit on at PPN. So why do you think, or what do you think it is that holds organisations back who haven't got that in place properly? I mean, is it the culture? Could it even be ego based, or is it something else that we should be looking at?
Yeah, was that one for
me?
Yeah,
Dave.
cool.
Yeah, sorry.
Cool, yeah. Yes. So definitely it's a cultural thing. It's having that collaboration, those relationships in place, recruiting the right kind of personalities into those roles. Sometimes you can get a bit of finger pointing back and forth between these kind of two teams, which isn't very useful. Sometimes procurement people can just think a bit too process heavy in their own processes and just run their processes and then chuck it over to P2P and then move on to the next process. Really making sure you're asking the right questions of your teams. Have you thought about X? Have you thought about Y?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, do you think it's possible to change the culture in an organisation, Dave? I mean, if you recognise it's a cultural piece and it's been going on for some time, what are the kind of things that you can do, or maybe you think that you can't change it?
You definitely can. Asking the right questions is key. Recruiting the right kind of people into the organisation with the right behaviours and in the right way, calling out when things aren't working. And having a continuous improvement mentality. That's something that John Lewis that we had a CI team. One of my team members was a black belt in continuous improvement rather than martial arts. His role was
and I was thinking carrot and stick there. I was thinking, taking it a bit far, Dave.
Yeah, so that's a good example of an end-to-end process where he would really look at what's the problem statement we're trying to solve here. What's the as is? what's the to be, and then you pull in people from procurement, AP, the capital finance team, whoever.
Yeah, and I suppose, that's important, having that clear visibility, and that helps having that, I guess, a visualization map as well of what you're hoping to achieve. In your experience, Stephen, what are the key indicators of success? If you're looking to promote collaboration across an organization, what should you be looking for as an indicator that that's been successful?
To me, it's communication between the teams, and the teams not being afraid to speak up if they find a particular process is not working the way it should. Other things like I would look for is like really KPIs around things like on-time payments to suppliers. You may want to do some sort of surveys out in with your stakeholders out in the business, or even supplier surveys, to identify any particular issues or whether they're all particularly happy with the processes and the service that's being provided, particularly if it's a shared service or BPO environment where they're dealing with kind of lots of volume, and you really want that feedback into your particular teams. And things like just the length of time it takes for things like, as Dave said, onboarding suppliers is a key one. Making sure you've got the right level of communication going back into the supplier. So be it onboarding guides so that the supplier knows how to get paid, or your expectation around whether you're running a no PO, no payment type process, and then really just monitoring that type of activity to make sure the suppliers are following the particular process. And then if there is any particular issues with the process, using your continuous improvement team to investigate the root causes and make changes to the process and make it better.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's an interesting point there, actually, Stephen. If you're putting the KPIs in place to actually make sure that they're happening and to monitor that, and if they're not happening the way you want them to, talk about a no PO, no pay policy, to actually do something about it. Because if you've got that policy in place, and sort of to some extent you let it slide, then people no longer take it seriously as if that's something you want to achieve.
So to me, it doesn't have to be like overkill in KPIs. It really just needs to be maybe half a dozen to a dozen industry standard ones you can benchmark using benchmarking companies against your peer group, or internal measures to make sure you're hitting the targets. And if you're not, understanding the reasons why and working with the various teams in like procurement or finance or AP to address those particular issues and just make a really smooth process.
And I guess to some extent that comes back down to communication again then, doesn't it? Dave, we've talked about what collaboration should look like to some extent, but what happens to those organizations who think, oh, no, we don't need to do that. We're fine. We're okay doing what we're doing. We're all subject matter experts in this area that we know. We don't need to collaborate. What's the end result in organizations that you've come across where that's been the ethos?
Chaos probably is how I'd summarize it. So missed opportunity, chaos. So one real example, if you like, was we used to create, again, John Lewis, we used to create a new supplier every business hour, believe it or not.
Right.
So the first thing in terms of collaboration and communicating it was, were people aware of that? Were the exec aware of that? Was the CFO aware of that? No, they weren't. And then that became the strap line from a KPI perspective. It's not good to create one supplier a business hour. How do you ensure their risk? How do you measure the risk of those suppliers? GDPR, modern slavery, all these key things as a really powerful brand name. So that's the risk that happens if you don't collaborate, because it was a different team. It wasn't procurement creating the new suppliers. It was in the AP side of the fence. But then solving it was a team effort to resolve it.
Yeah, and I suppose that just highlights, doesn't it, how important it is. You can't have those two areas operating completely separately. Correct. Because, as you say, chaos can be the end result. Is there anything that you would add to that, Stephen, from your point of view?
I think there's a cost perspective and to be looked at as well, cost per transaction, or even just cost of doing business, setting up lots of different suppliers, and the lack of collaboration between the teams. So you might have like the usual analogy that I hear in various businesses is using all four supermarkets when maybe you should just use one, So for having multiple suppliers that just supply the same sort of thing. So that doesn't help procurement because it's really, you're looking to consolidate, you're looking cost per transaction, you're looking for collaboration across the teams. When that doesn't happen, you all tend to work in silos. There's missed opportunities around making a really good slick process, and you end up getting to a stage where if something does go wrong, there's lots of blame circles going on and finger pointing and mistrust in the teams. So you want to really get them all working together, pulling the same direction and understanding what each other's roles and responsibilities are and how you can all work together to improve it.
And I suppose maybe feeling enabled to share those experiences as well. You talk there about, blame circles. It's sort of, you don't want to encourage that kind of culture to grow in your organization, which I suppose to some extent it's easy to do if you're not careful, isn't it?
Yeah.
How important, though, Stephen, do you think it is to have someone who heads up that collaboration piece?
I think in businesses I've worked in that work well, you will have a P2P global process owner who's responsible for that whole end-to-end process and can cut across the various teams. So it could be someone in procurement that understands the finance and AP side of it. It could be a finance person or transformation person or even continuous improvement. It understands the end-to-end process, but then can leverage the resources and collaboration in the various teams to keep on improving the processes and making it better for everyone.
And I suppose, at the moment, we've got it's much more regulatory environment than it has been historically. Dave, do you think that with new regulations coming in finance and from procurement as well, you mentioned modern slavery, do you think that collaboration piece is going to be something that all procure-to-pay departments need to have in place in the future?
Yeah, definitely has to be in place. The whole thing has to be locked down end to end with things like sustainability is a great example. Kind of carbon counting, you have to look at your end-to-end cycle involving all teams. From modern slavery perspective, it's all very well procurement creating contracts and audit processes that are robust, but then if you've got the P2P team creating a new supplier every business hour, without that rigor, then there's a bit of a disconnect there. Like all the Father Christmases and all the John Lewis branches, for example, if they're all just being created as individual sole traders, and how are you ensuring that the DBS checks are done properly and appropriately? If they're being paid by check, for example, by the AP team, which is another example that was happening.
Right.
So you need to kind of close all of these things down, and you can only do that by working as a team completely end to end.
Yeah. And again, I suppose that highlights the need for visibility as well, doesn't it? And that makes me think about the technology. How important do you think technology is? Stephen, I know you've been heavily involved in technology across procure to pay. It's been an increase in collaboration, as I said, between finance and procurement over the last few years. To what extent do you think that having that technology piece in place has helped?
I think if you want to take your business to the next level and you want to eliminate some of these manual tasks and processes and increase the collaboration through the whole P2P process, technology is key. So it could be at the beginning of the process, you're looking at source to pay type solutions, supplier onboarding portals, looking at things like how do you automate and digitize things like supplier forms and all these different checks around anti-slavery or the ESG type checks that's now been coming into a lot of businesses a lot more, right through to the basic things like invoice capture solutions that's been around for decades, but it really amazes me when I go into businesses that they still struggle with this concept, right through until the other end, looking at things like duplicate invoice detection and really detecting frauds or systems that will do that for you. And even basic things like statement reconciliations to make sure you're picking up any credits or identifying any duplicate invoices that then you can feed back into the process and improve it and close off those issues that's causing this effect further down the stream.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there that some organisations have not yet got on board with it. Even after all these years that we've had technology, the procure-to-pay technology there in place. I mean, have you got any ideas as to why that is? Is it because they have existing legacy solutions, or what do you think the main reasons for that is, Stephen?
I think it's more around they'll have legacy on-premise solutions that don't really lend itself to, I suppose, best of breed invoice capture type solutions or try to connect them up to them. If they're moving to the cloud, then those systems seem to be a lot better when it comes to invoice capture. Some of it's just really resistance to change within the business itself. Another reason there'll be budget. So if they're looking at really implementing a system that is quite a big project to implement some of these systems and license costs and things like that. So it might just be the economic environment doesn't lend itself at that point in time to implementing these systems and improving the system and training people and that sort of thing. But I do find some of it is really, if they've been doing a process for a long time and the people's been in the business for a long time, then they may not know what's happening out in the wider world when it comes to technology. And if it's working pretty much as they expect, but they've got a lot of manual processes in there, it's like, why would they want to kind of take the risk if they implement a system, something goes wrong? So it's just really ensuring that whatever they're implementing is done properly and there's buy-in from all the different teams in the process, including the procurement side of it as well, so they understand the whole end-to-end process and really what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different strands as to reasons why, as you just mentioned. Dave, do you recognise any of those? I mean, maybe the reasons why people don't go ahead with technology, or maybe you've found that in the companies that you've worked with, technology has enabled that collaboration piece to work better.
Yeah, I think it's procurement sometimes are bad at writing business cases for change. So it's storytelling. So what is the problem? What is the problem statement today? How is it pertinent to the board? And how can it help them achieve their objectives? The board don't particularly care about the number of suppliers that are added, but they do care about the risks of those suppliers being added, and the impact of Father Christmas not going through the proper due diligence, which was the case sort of about 8 years ago. So it's like they do care about that. So it's bringing it to life for them, storytelling, looking at TED Talks. You know, people are very powerful at that. That's what I would suggest everyone in procurement does. Really understands that.
It's interesting, actually. You talk about that storytelling, because as humans, that's the thing that we understand and brings our hearts and minds into something, into a transformation program. If we only talk about technology, which of course we have to do, if we only talk about it in terms of facts and figures, it loses something along the way. You have to actually, as you say, bring that to life and tell a story. So I think that's a good point to add to it, because as you sort of alluded to, Stephen, sometimes it can be a case of inertia as well, can't it? It's sort of, well, like you say, we've always been doing it this way. It's kind of working all right. Nothing's going wrong. And we're happy with the way that things are. It can actually be quite tricky for organizations to see above that and think, well, things are fine as they are, but actually they could be even more fine than they are now.
Yeah.
One, if you put this collaboration piece in place and then added the technology alongside it. And Stephen, we mentioned a little bit earlier on about KPIs, and one of the interesting things that came out of our PPN annual survey earlier on this year was that the respondents felt that collaboration worked better where some of those KPIs were shared. If we're talking about shared KPIs, which, in people listening to our conversation today, what do you think though they should be?
I think it's the main one for P2P is really paying your suppliers on time and understanding the reasons why you don't pay your suppliers on time. That would be key for me. There's other ones around things like raising after the facts POs, or even just looking at how many suppliers are actually you're insisting, well, we need a PO for that supplier versus non-PO suppliers, and looking at the spend type and the spend categories to identify whether there's scope there for a PO to be introduced or whether it's always going to sit outside that scope. Looking at things like the length of time it's taken for, like, to say, set up a supplier, how can that be done more slickly and improve that type of process? Even the volumes of suppliers you're setting up, you will have in certain types of business, like John Lewis, as Dave said, you will always have a certain percentage churn of suppliers, but it's identifying, like, you're not setting up the same supplier, like 10 or the same type of supplier supplying the same type of goods or service 10 different times, because it really helps procurement if you can consolidate suppliers down for the negotiation piece on it, and just really monitoring that and sharing that information across the various teams with procurement, and just even having that sense check with procurement on, do we need a supplier if certain other parts of the business are just constantly requesting suppliers? Is there a better way of doing it?
Thanks, Stephen. And Dave, have you got any other KPIs that you think would be beneficial to share between procurement and the finance team?
Yeah, payments obviously are key. Number of suppliers created, number of suppliers per category, how long's the tail, is there any consolidation that can be carried out in that end-to-end view. A really good, really powerful one is the amount of spend that's automated via catalogs. How's that adoption going? Number of suppliers on the invoicing platform, number of invoices received manually versus via the machine. There's loads, but I guess it's back to what I said earlier. It's what's relevant to the board and the business's strategy.
Yes.
Does the board really care about the number of invoices? They care about it if it's costing them extra money. CFO would care, but they wouldn't really care if it's not costing them extra money. It's a bit of an irritant to AP and procurement if there's lots of manual invoice processing, but no one really cares unless it causes them pain.
So bring it home, I guess, to make sure that, again, going back to what you were saying about telling the story around it, and if you're helping to pay your suppliers on time, or I guess maybe conversely, if you're not paying your suppliers on time, you don't want to be a company that's up there in the headlines for bad payment of suppliers, or inefficient processes, which may then lead to falling foul of modern day slavery policies. So there are, I guess, some of those things that you shared, organizations can certainly look to help that collaboration piece and then to gain efficiencies from it. So I guess finally, maybe you could share a couple of stories where you talked about storytelling, Dave, and maybe you can share a story where a collaboration piece has worked really well in your experience, and some of the benefits that have come out of it.
Yeah, so I'd say kind of stopping the supplier onboarding thing, so the supplier every business hour piece, really diving into what the problem statement was. Why were people adding new suppliers and what it really came down to is lack of visibility of who the right suppliers were. So we went out and looked at technology to kind of solve that problem.
Yeah.
Guided buying technology, we actually chose Cooper in the John Lewis, in the John Lewis scenario. Another problem statement where collaboration was key is around GDPR, supplier onboarding, making sure the suppliers were going through the right due diligence checks, they were renewing the insurances that they put in place, etc. That was another great, another great example of collaboration end to end. But just shutting off the suppliers, so we could have easily just shut off the ability to add new suppliers. And all of our branches, 300 plus Waitroses and 50 odd John Lewis's at the time, would have ceased trading. So it's really asking yourself, well, why are people adding a supplier every business hour? And then making sure that they have visibility of the right route, because my experience is most people want to do the right thing. The only reason they're doing the wrong thing is because the wrong thing is either it's easier for them to do the wrong thing, or B, they don't know what the right thing is. And it's one of those two scenarios normally, in my experience.
Don't know the right thing, or it's easier. Exactly, yes. And I guess that comes back to making sure you've got that communication right in the first place as well. I mean, you can have as much technology as you like within a process, but if you haven't got that communication right, it's never going to be as efficient as you would like it to be.
Correct. Yeah.
Stephen, sorry.
How do you communicate? I was just going to add, how do you communicate if you've got a very remote workforce? Branch managers, retail staff, warehouse leaders, warehouse workers. How do you tailor your communication to those individual audiences?
Yeah,
and sure everyone knows how to do things to their individual requirements.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads on to a sort of like a more of a change management conversation as well, doesn't it? Which it is going to be very important if you're an organization which doesn't collaborate very well. That whole change management piece will have to play a really important part, I think, because you're talking about you've got various remote workers. What isn't going to work well, which I know some companies that I've spoken to have had in the past, is a change management document just emailed into the inbox and then tick box, we've changed people. But that, as you know, is not going to ever work properly. Stephen, do you have a story to share where the benefits of collaboration have really shone out?
I think to me, it's understanding the entire process and communicating that high level into the teams. So I'm working on various transformation projects or process improvement type projects. The key for me is understanding really the KPIs and how you can benchmark them against like peer group companies. So you've got a starting point, so you know whether you're really good at a particular process or you need to improve, or you're excellent at it, but understanding what level you want to achieve. So it might, to get to world class, it might be a case of you have to spend a ton of money doing that, but you might just be better just sitting at good or excellent at that particular thing. Collaboration between the teams is really key for me. It's the best kind of projects I've worked in where you've had representation from procurement, the AP team, the finance team, the tax team, to understand how the whole process fits together, and looking at each stage of the process to understand where the potential issues might be and how you can fix them with new technology. But the starting point for me is having a look at the KPIs and having an open and honest conversation around like even things like headcount. There's KPIs out there you can work out when you benchmark them, how many people you should have in a particular team. And then looking at, well, you might be paying all your suppliers pretty much 95% of the time on time, but you might have 10 extra people in the team to do it because it's a completely manual process. So it's looking for those opportunities to automate, but also looking for those opportunities in the team to show them what's in it for them, be it upskilling them in the latest technology or making more interesting roles for them in the organisation through technology, and just making sure really everyone really knows what the other team should be doing, and you've got that collaboration and that communication working well between the different teams. So if something does go wrong and you need to fix it quickly, then you really know who to contact in that business.
Yeah, and that's going to be key. And I think, listening to you there, hearing that open and honest communication
Yeah.
is going to be so important, isn't it, for the company going forward? There are that great conversation between the two of you and all of us today. But is there any final bits of advice that you'd want to share with the network, Dave? Do you think that have we covered everything?
I mean, the one key takeaway probably on this collaboration point is think about the outcomes. Why are you wanting to collaborate in the first place? What, number one? Number two, what matters to the board?
Yeah.
Number three, how are you going to tell the right story to communicate it?
Yeah.
Those are my
Fantastic.
closing thoughts. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. Stephen, any closing thoughts from you than you've already shared with us?
I think to me, collaboration is key, but also showing the people in the various teams what's really in it for them, how they can benefit from the collaboration and working together, just really to understand each other's processes. And then if they come a point in time where they outgrow a particular role, there's that opportunity they may understand AP or procurement or the finance side of it to go and do something else in their career that will enhance their experience and enhance their kind of work life. I think as well, technology is key because it's like a lot of the times I'm going into businesses and I'm like, really, if the technology was there, and a lot of it is quite inexpensive these days because it's been around for decades, and it still surprises me how people will struggle on with a manual process because they don't want to change it in case anything it knocks out the process or something happening. So I think it's like keeping your eyes open for those automation opportunities. Collaboration definitely is key, and even cross training between the teams. If you're not doing that in your particular business, I would start doing that so everyone understands each other's role in the process and they understand where they can help enhance it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. I mean, I think they've got some great ideas for everybody listening today. Even if you are already collaborating well together, I think you've picked up some good insights today from both of you guys, and I'm sure everyone listening can benefit from the conversation. For me, the things that stand out are about having that open and honest communication and getting those, making sure you understand the opportunities, both from ourselves within the organization and how we can develop our own careers, and also in looking along that end-to-end process as well. So thanks both for sharing your insights with the PPN community, and thanks for everyone for listening. Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.